there was a part of me that was worried that, like, what if I have regrets? Like, that would be terrible. It's just like, I never thought that I would have regrets, but, it's just like you're not sure until you actually do it. And now it's like, this is the best decision I've ever made in my entire life. I mean, I knew that I would be relieved and very happy, but I didn't think I would be this relieved and this happy. Any doubts that I had, any, second thoughts, any, like, what ifs, or like, what if I don't like my scars? What if it feels inauthentic? All of those worries are just gone. All I see in my future is hope right now. And I know obviously I'll have struggles, but like, right now, it's like, I just gained like 1,000 more reasons to live, and it's so huge. And I didn't think that I would be this elated, but like, I'm so proud of myself for doing this. I am so proud of my chest, and I just can't wait to live my life. So, here's the deal. I'm detransitioning.
Hey guys, it's Daisy. I go by Ali now because I am a female-to-male transgender. I identify as male. I am a trans male. I've been through many different other identities, including genderqueer, agender, and of course female. But as of right now, male just seems the most comfortable for me.
So, I've officially been through the first year of my second puberty. 1 year of testosterone injections once a week, and this is what I look like. This is what I sound like. This is who I am.
This is my voice pre-T. This is my voice 1 month on T. And I am officially 2 months on testosterone today.
This is my voice 5 months on testosterone. This is my voice 6.5 months on T. This is my voice 8 months on T. This is my voice 1 year on testosterone. I am getting top surgery in the morning. I am Dr. Shore's first patient of the day. I don't know how many patients she has, like, on an average day, but I'm the first one. So it's the morning of surgery, and I'm going to be sliced and diced. Can't stop saying that. In about 2.5 hours. So I'm in the pre-op room, and I'm just waiting for someone to come in. Yep, don't have an IV in or anything, just in a gown. We'll see what happens. I was told that people who have gender dysphoria need to transition. Like, they can't survive without transitioning. And where I made a grave error was thinking that I needed to change my body. I wish I could just, like, very harshly say to my young pre-testosterone but trans-identifying self, like, don't do any of this, don't go on T, don't get surgery, don't even change your name, like, just stop.
My girls are 10 and 12. They were 8 and 10 when I started this campaign. So I became concerned about what I see as a cult in our society affecting all these girls. And no matter what kind of socioeconomic status you come from, what kind of family you come from, no kids are immune to cult-like behavior. And this is all in our schools. So I wanted to make sure I learned all about it so I could protect my own kids. And I'm not worried about them at all. They're totally fine. But the more I learned, the more I couldn't stay silent, because we got tens of thousands of kids coming to harm. And the parents whose families are affected by this can't say anything, because then they would alienate their own child. And so the more parents I talk to and the more people I meet and the more I learn about this, the more it drives me, because the more you research this, the crazier it gets. And we just have to put a stop to it.
Billboard Chris is my kind of guy. He uses signboards and I use a camera, but otherwise, our goals and motives are very much the same. Protect our kids, fight propaganda, and tell people what's actually going on in the world. And over the past couple of years, Chris and I have been interested in the same issue.
These children are becoming sterilized from the combination of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. These drugs are used off-label. They've never been approved for this purpose. This drug is actually a chemical castration drug. But we give this to kids for years. At 9, 10, 11 years of age, we have 13-year-old girls getting their breasts cut off. We have over 40,000 girls on GoFundMe right now raising money for what they call top surgery. So the whole thing is just madness, and we need to create awareness, because when enough people figure out what's going on and when enough parents find out what's going on, they're going to put a stop to this.
So what is going on? Is it as bad as Chris makes it out to be? If so, how did it come to this? And who is behind it? That's what I intend to find out.
Caitlyn Jenner dazzles as she accepts the Woman of the Year award from Glamour magazine.
Amy Schneider's winning streak on Jeopardy made her the show's first transgender champion and brought an invitation to the White House.
Admiral Rachel Levine is the U.S. Assistant Secretary for Health in the Biden administration. And USA Today just named her one of its Women of the Year.
The transgender phenomenon kicked into high gear in 2015 when champion decathlete Bruce Jenner told people to start calling him Caitlyn. And with all their media coverage, you might think that the transgender issue is primarily about middle-aged men presenting as women. But, as it turns out, that's not really where the action is.
Increasingly, it looks like it's high school and college age girls and women who have no history of any gender struggles, who all of a sudden will come out either as trans or as non-binary or as fluid.
I am genderqueer, transmasc, and queer.
And so this looks very different than the historic understanding of gender dysphoria, which was largely a phenomenon in like smaller, younger boys and in middle-aged men.
Historically, over 80% of children who experienced cross-sex self-identification were boys. That constituted about 0.02% of the population. Of those boys, 80% of them would get over it early in puberty. And by the time you got to young adulthood, 92% of them get over it.
And as for the middle-aged men, there are generally two groups.
There are men who have same-sex attractions, and they're embarrassed by that. And so they rationalize it by saying, well, I wasn't really supposed to be a man, I'm really supposed to be a woman. And that's one group. The other group are men who become aroused at the idea of themselves as women. They're known as autogynephiles.
Autogynephilia it's a heterosexual sexual dysfunction. Autogynephilia is where men will dress up in women's clothes and look at themselves in the mirror, and they become the object of their sexual affection.
But that is not the major transgender group today.
So I'd been working with teens, in New York City, in California. I'd worked in several schools in many different communities, many different socioeconomic backgrounds. I had never seen this many transgender kids in one spot, ever. And they were all girls.
The fact is, transgender cases in girls have exploded in recent years. So why is this? Well, one argument is that these girls are manifesting a biological condition.
At the University of Washington, psychology professor Christina Olson investigates the origins of being transgender.
Your biology determines a lot of your psychology, and I think that's kind of where the feeling is right now, that there are probably biological contributors that make a big contribution towards our sense of gender identity.
But that leads to some questions.
Why is it that all of a sudden there's 4 girls in the same middle school who are all self-identified males? How did that happen, if it's a biological reality? How is it possible that there's a 5,000% increase in a diagnosis like that if you think it's biologically caused? Was there some, asteroid that hit the Earth and caused a massive mutation in the human genome? What happened? Is there something in the drinking water in our town that's causing all of these young girls to think they're boys? Nobody is asking questions about biological realities because they know it's a psychological process and they don't want to address that.
Okay, But what about the idea that those biological trans kids have always been there?
The theory is that, well, the reason why there are more trans people coming out is because it's more socially accepted. If that were the case, then there would be both men and women of all ages coming out. That's not the case. It's an insane ratio in favor of adolescent girls.
Having been a 15-year-old girl who was there, do you think it is a social contagion?
I mean, it was for me.
My entire friend group, first we like all slowly realized we were gay, and now we're all slowly realizing we're trans. And I was like, if transgenderism is biological, then why would your friend group of 12 people, like one at a time, like dominoes, be realizing that you're trans? And those kinds of little things that, even though I pushed them to the back of my head, sort of forced me to think a little bit more critically, kind of helped push me in the opposite direction.
But what about people who don't have distinct male or female genitals? Doesn't that mean that there are more than two sexes biologically?
Well, that's what many of them say, is that there's infinity options. You can be anywhere on a spectrum, and they cite intersex people to justify that. And intersex people are those who were born with ambiguous genitalia. That's a very small population.
But those cases don't somehow invalidate the fact that there are only two gametes. There's a large gamete, small gamete, and that's true of all sexually reproducing species. That's not just true of human beings, right? There's no third gamete. There's no third option, okay? So I think the intersex card is played by activists who aren't really actually that concerned about supporting people who have congenital conditions of sexual development.
By and large, the intersex people don't want to be involved in this, but the trans rights people claim that because people are intersex, we're on a spectrum. And that's like saying, yeah, people aren't really bipedal because some people are born with only one leg.
There are people who rarely are born blind. That doesn't mean that we can no longer talk about human beings as species who see.
So if it's not biological, but rather some sort of psychological condition or social phenomenon, what is that condition? Who are these girls?
And what you find when you look at that subset of patients is that they have a 30% likelihood of being on the autism spectrum. Talk about capacity for being misled by social signals and things like that.
It makes a lot of sense because autistic kids have a number of issues that feed in really neatly to being answered by a trans identity.
If you struggle socially, you are a target for this.
They don't get along very well in a neurotypical and non-autistic society as far as how to relate to other people, how to get other people to like you, how to have conversations that flow well. And so they already feel at odds with other people. Trans comes along and says, oh, you don't fit in with other people because you're not actually the biological sex you think you are, you're trans.
There was all of this marketing towards me as someone who had never heard of that. And a lot of different things fed into it. I'm autistic, so I've never really been that good at like talking to people and that kind of thing. I had a few very close friends, but like not a really large friend group.
They also have very strong black and white thinking.
Autistic people tend to zero in on one thing.
And once they've made a decision, they're very black and white about that. I have given this lots of thought. I have made this decision. This is the way it is, and it's very hard to change their minds.
It is easy for them to really get sucked into this ideology and not be able to think nuanced and think outside of this gender ideology box.
You've got social media, you've got the entertainment industry, you've got the GSA club at school, you've got all of these factors telling these autistic kids, oh, you're trans, and the kids are thinking about it, and they're not necessarily talking to their parents, because that's another feature of autism, is they're a lot in their heads, and they're not necessarily verbally processing that with their parents, and so they spend all this time thinking about it, they make this decision, and that black and white thinking really cements them there.
So the combination of feeling out of place and struggling socially, and also kind of having the type of brain where they focus on one thing, I think that's how they get sucked into becoming trans.
Gender dysphoria is more physically focused. It's more of a problem with the physical body, whereas what and I think a lot of adolescent girls who think they might be trans are going through has to do more with being perceived
You know, when I was a teenager, when I was in high school, you know, people would go goth, right? Paint their fingernails black, you know, wear black trench coats, this, that, and the other thing. It almost seems like trans or gender non-binary or gender fluid is the new version of, you know, what makes you unique to stand out during the teenage, high school, college years.
I saw all these other trans men, all these handsome, buff Aidens and Elliots, and I wanted to be like them. I wanted to be accepted and liked and celebrated the way that they were. I was like, oh, I'm gonna be so cute. I'm gonna be this like artsy gay guy type, and that'll be my place in the world.
The influencers, they make it look so fun. They are cute, they're quirky, they're exciting. If you are a teenager, it feels like a piece of crap, and you're online and you're sitting there by yourself in your bedroom and you don't have friends, and you're looking at that, you just look at that and you say, I want to be like those people.
And what's particularly tragic about this is that unlike, you know, going goth, you know, 6 months, a year later, you realize, well, that was a silly stage that I went through, and there are no lasting consequences. You know, with this, there can be long-term, you know, indeed permanent consequences.
If you become trans, you get a whole new status. All these people notice you when you were probably invisible before.
I worked with a young man in California who was in a family of 8 children. And when he contacted me, he had gone through and had some surgeries. And so I asked him, I said, well, why did you do this? And he says, well, I don't know. And I said, oh, yeah, you do. And he said, no, I don't. So we had this conversation, several emails. And he says, okay, well, he said, I really did this because I had all these brothers and sisters. I never felt like anyone ever knew I was there. When I identified as a transgender female, everybody knew I was there. So it had nothing to do with gender dysphoria. It had nothing to do with he wanted people to know he existed.
Why are young teenage girls today, in numbers we've never seen, transitioning? Well, put yourself in their shoes.
It's very hard to be a young woman in our, you know, very toxic, sexualized culture. And so I'm not surprised that, you know, many women are just saying, I am opting out.
The average age that a child encounters hardcore pornography now is 9 years old. 9 years old. If you have a boy who's like slipping into adolescence, who's been surfing porn for a couple of years, right, and a girl shows up in school who's developing breasts, that girl's likely to suffer verbal abuse from that boy, right? That's another factor that's probably stimulating this desire among certain girls to not want to be girls anymore. Because as they manifest their secondary sexual characteristics, they're encountering this horror of sexualized, porn-saturated middle school boys or high school boys who make them feel like they're in danger. And if they just didn't look so much like girls, they wouldn't feel like they're in danger. They wouldn't be hiding out in the bathroom during lunch.
I think pornography is one of the worst things that's ever happened to society. Like, I think pornography is where a lot of that comes from.
Porn is horrific. I think for so long we've sort of winked at porn and nudged and, oh, porn is kind of funny. And I've heard of therapists tell couples who are having trouble with their marriage, oh, watch porn together. No, it's insidious, it's awful, and it has gotten brutal.
If a girl enters the world of pornography, you know, 9, 10, 11 years old, the majority of what she's going to see is women being sexually horrifically abused.
Today's porn is not the Playboy and Penthouse of our youth.
The porn I was exposed to when I was young, Playboy magazine and the like, it's innocent compared to the porn these kids have on their smartphones right at the touch of their thumbs, right? We're talking violent rape and degradation porn.
I worry that a lot of parents are very kind of passive about it. It's like, oh, you know, I saw porn when I was 12. It's like, yeah, you saw like a Playboy magazine. You saw like naked bodies. You weren't seeing borderline snuff films, like films that you can't even be sure that they're not watching someone under 18 get raped.
So many young girls are seeing this, and that's their impression of what a sexual relationship is.
It's like the mainstream sort of like hyper-libertarian idea of like, oh yeah, that's fine. Like, if you like to beat up your girlfriend while you're having sex with her, that's normal and like cool, kinky, like, and you'll even like get made fun of for being vanilla or whatever.
Not only are the girls being exposed to this, but the boys that the girls are hanging out with, they're on a constant drip, a constant feed of this porn, and these boys are demanding of these girls that they perform these kinds of activities with them.
And what's the odds that an adolescent child is going to see that as a beautiful thing? Some number approaching 0.
When you are formed to think this is what men want of women, and this is how women are treated by men, well, no wonder women don't want to be women in that environment.
We were out playing, and there was a utility access underground, and the covering of it had been lifted off. And so my brother and I went down into this hole because it was cool, and that's what you do when you're little kids, I guess. And we were down there pretending like we were in a starship or something, and suddenly some hands just reached down and pulled me out. And somebody else grabbed my brother, and there was a restroom nearby, a public restroom for the park, and they pushed me in. And I was trying to get away. I was fighting. I was screaming and kicking. And these men had a knife, and they put it against my brother, and they told me they would cut his penis off if I did not cooperate. And of course, cooperating, because I love my brother. But after it, I just decided I wasn't going to be Aaron anymore. That I was going to be Timothy, because that would keep me safe from what happened. I didn't want that to happen again. So basically, I just became a different person.
In the 6th grade, I was on the Summer League swimming and diving team. And our Summer League diving coach, we also worked out on the trampoline. So there were times that we were driving from the pool to the trampoline, and he would drive, and he would often put me sitting next to him, and he would play with me. And then on another opportunity, he had me, got me in his apartment, and I was sexually abused. So at that time, I was in a case of sexual abuse where I developed a hatred toward my own male genitalia. I wanted it gone.
So here I am before I'm 10 years old. I got a grandma putting me in a purple dress and affirming me as a girl and not affirming me as a boy. I got a dad who's trying to reshape me into a man with a hardwood floor plank, and I got an uncle who's sexually molesting me, all before I'm 10 years old. So, you know, a young person under the age of 10 is not very well equipped to deal with these circumstances. So what do you do with them? And so you internalize them. I worked with one 13-year-old girl here just several months ago now. We said, okay, why are you doing this? Why don't you like who you are? And she paused. Her answer was, I had a bad dad. And she was abused sexually. They're broken people that we need to help them realize what broke them.
Of all the thousands of people that you talk to, how many have not been broken in some way in the past?
None.
I haven't talked to a single person who developed a transgender identity that didn't have some kind of a profound trauma in their past. Sometimes it's not sexual assault. Sometimes it's something like having a parent who makes it clear that they don't want that child being the sex that they are, and that children will accommodate these kind of desires of parents. Sometimes it's a divorce where the child is convinced that if they had been the opposite sex, the divorce wouldn't take place. But a lot of times it's a sexual assault.
Many of the individuals, boys and girls, boys, if they were sexually molested as a young person, want to cut their genitalia off, not to become a woman, not to become a woman. Why? They cut their genitalia off so that they will never be sexually touched or abused again. And they see the only way to accomplish that is to remove what was being touched. A girl, on the other hand, who is sexually abused will make herself appear as male as she can as a way to repel any persons who might want to sexually abuse them.
I saw a lot of, especially girls, who've had some kind of sexual trauma, that in the past they might have worn baggy clothes or gained extra weight or cut their hair just to not get that attention from men. That's very uncomfortable for them, extra uncomfortable if they've had some sexual trauma. And so I think this transgender thing is really a way to take away a lot of those very painful, ugly feelings that they're feeling.
So the trans issue in young girls sure seems to be a multifaceted psychological condition. According to Dr. Patrick Lappert, what we are dealing with here is a type of body dysmorphic disorder.
And body dysmorphic disorder is a condition where a patient will present with some fairly ordinary kind of a question like, I'm interested in having a rhinoplasty. I want you to change the appearance of my nose. Well, this is a common reason for consultation with a plastic surgeon. And, you review their history and you're talking to them. And while you talk to them, you're trying to get an understanding of their motivation. And while you're trying to get an understanding of their motivation, you're actually looking at their nose without being obvious about it, but you're looking at their nose and you're kind of sizing things up. And the person with body dysmorphic disorder, they'll be describing a nose that to them looks like a horror. And they'll start saying things to you that suggest that they think that everything that's wrong in their life is the result of the contour of their nose. They're convinced that the reason they're lonely, or they'll think that the reason they're not getting promoted at work, or the reason why, life is a misery is because of the contour of their nose. And what they're telling you is that they're so invested in what you're going to do to their nose that they expect it's going to be life-changing. That if you correct their nose, all of their sorrows will go away. That's the key. And so essentially what they're asking you to do is to solve an interior wound by changing their external appearance. That's body dysmorphic disorder in a nutshell. This is the case with transgender. The person has an interior wound and they're seeking an external explanation for it. It's not their body mass index or the contour of their nose, it's their sex self. They invest in that, the explanation for all of their sorrows, and they want you to change it, thinking that if they change it, all will be well. It's the same process, and you do not offer aesthetic surgery to a person with body dysmorphic disorder. It is considered a misdiagnosis. You missed the diagnosis and you did the wrong thing for this person. You didn't serve their best interest. You may have served your cash register, but you didn't do that person any good at all.
So what would do the person good? What is the proper course of action here?
We have all sorts of feelings that don't align with reality. And the historic practice of psychology and psychiatry was to help people line up their thoughts and their feelings with reality, right? So if you thought you were overweight, if you thought you were unattractive, if you thought that you needed to starve yourself, no one would say, oh, yep, prescribe liposuction. They would say, no, we're going to help you get your thoughts and your feelings in touch with reality. From my perspective, the good doctors say, rather than doing what's impossible, transforming reality to line up with false thoughts and feelings, let's at least attempt to do what is possible, helping people line up their thoughts and their feelings with reality, including the reality of their own bodies.
This is often called cognitive therapy, and Erin Brewer is an excellent example of the good that it can do.
When first grade started up, my teachers were really concerned because I had been a fairly happy-go-lucky kindergartner, kind of quirky, and I came into first grade and I was just a mess. I was angry. I would yell at the teacher. I would kick other kids. I didn't want anything to do with the girls. I just wanted to play with the boys. I wanted to go into the boys' bathroom. I just didn't want to be a girl. I didn't want that danger. And I felt so ashamed of what happened. I thought it was my fault. I thought if I were a boy, it wouldn't have happened. And thankfully, the teacher referred me to the school psychologist and got me help.
Erin likely wouldn't have got that same kind of help today, as the approach to cases like hers has completely changed.
I did a lot of research, and the books were telling me, the journal articles were telling me, and everything I was hearing was that I had a birth defect possibly my mind was washed with the wrong hormones when I was in utero, and that I needed to change my body to match my mind. Otherwise, I wasn't going to get over this.
This is the reason why the language of transgender has been intentionally modified to take away. It's called depathologizing. This is what the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual did 7-8 years ago, is they changed it from gender identity disorder, which obviously smacks of a psychological problem. They call it now gender dysphoria. And really, and all they'll allow you is that the person's unhappy, but they're unhappy because of a biological reality.
Therapists are no longer want to see this as a mental illness. They changed it to reduce the stigma, but they wanted to keep it in the DSM so that insurance can still pay for treatment. So they want it both ways.
This is the problem that the psychology world has faced. They don't want you to think of transgenderism as a psychiatric, psychological process that the person is suffering under, right? But yet they want to bill insurance companies, so it's got to sound like a medical condition. So they came up with gender dysphoria, and all the while they're waving their hands going, but this is not a pathology. This is just, it's kind of like a diagnosis, but it's not a pathology. Well, if it's not a pathology, why are we amputating people's genitals and breasts? What's that about, right? Is it an objective reality or not? And if it is an objective reality, why are you operating on their genitals? Since we stopped doing frontal lobotomies, nobody has done surgery for a psychological problem. How are you going to heal a wounded heart by operating on people's genitals? And yet, my profession fully embraced that now.
What happened to my profession? I gotta tell you, the reason I started to speak out, because this is not my personality to speak out, is because I came back from my disability, and it was so hard for me to recognize and see that it's my profession that's hurting children. The buzzword is gender affirmative, gender affirmative. I actually never heard of that in 20 plus years until a year and a half ago. I know it was a thing in some specialized gender clinics, but that was not mainstream, and now that's all they say.
The only option available now for therapists is to affirm and to put them on a path towards medicalization.
I've read so many stories and heard detransitioners talk about, and I've heard parents of kids who transition saying, my child had been in therapy for autism, had been in therapy for depression, had been in therapy for self-harm. And as soon as the child said, I think I may be trans, the therapist wouldn't deal with anything else anymore. I want to say that's not all therapists, but that's really being pushed in the therapy community, that you cannot do anything except move a child toward medicalization.
If you're a therapist, you know that affirming anything is not therapy. I can get affirming therapy from my dog. I do not get affirming therapy from a human being. I need someone to challenge me and to test me and to help me think through and gain insight in my life so I can make better choices. Affirming therapy sounds nice, but it's not helping somebody who's hurting and making decisions that may be maladaptive in their life.
This is the one condition in the whole world where we let a child self-diagnose themselves as being the opposite sex and just go along with whatever they want. What's the point of these endocrinologists going to school for 8 years to become a specialist doctor when they just listen to a 10-year-old that walks into their office?
This is one of the great shortcomings in the world of the transgender treatment industry, is the role that the plastic surgeon plays in that whole process, which begins perhaps with puberty blockade in an early adolescent child and has now gone through cross-sex hormones and social transitioning, and now gets that referral letter from the licensed social worker or the psychologist saying, this is a fully, transgender person, go get him. And what you find is that there's no diagnostic process for the plastic surgeon. Essentially, if you walk that whole process back, the person making the diagnosis, in many cases, is a pre-adolescent child who's suffering from profound anxiety and possibly depression. And they're the ones who made the diagnosis because nobody gave them the contravening reality check like cognitive behavioral therapy might. They were all encouraging this child. So essentially, the plastic surgeon is getting preoperative consultation and consent for perhaps a mastectomy in a 15-year-old girl. I mean, the WPATH recommendation, version 8, is now going to recommend that you can do mastectomies in 13-year-old girls, okay? So you've got a 13, 15, 17-year-old young lady who's going to have a mastectomy, and the plastic surgeon is relying on a diagnosis that was made by that child perhaps 10 years before, and nobody has waved a flag on this and said, wait a minute, what are we doing here? The plastic surgeon at that point is a technician, and that is contrary to everything I learned as a surgeon.
The transgender activists' response to this is that children know who they are, and we must trust what they tell us, even before those children know how to talk.
So let me give you an example. I have a colleague who's transgender, and there is a video of him as a toddler. So he was assigned female at birth. There is a video of him as a toddler tearing barrettes out of then her hair and throwing them on the ground and sobbing. That's a gender message. There was one where this child wore the little onesies with snap-ups in between the legs, and at age 1 would unsnap them to make a dress and have the dress flow. This was a child who was assigned male. That's a communication, a pre-verbal communication about gender.
When I hear trans rights advocates say children know who they are, I just think, have you ever raised a child? Diane Ehrensaft says that if an 18-month-old girl pulls a barrette out of her hair, she's sending a gender message. She's trying to tell you that she's not really a girl. And I think, have you ever been around a child? When my son was 18 months old, every time we'd get in the car, he'd pull his shoes off and throw them. What did that mean? What was he trying to tell us? That he really should be an amputee because he doesn't want to have feet? Ridiculous.
And on top of that, the message we are supposed to be listening for seems to be rather regressive.
Part of what led me to being transgender in the first place, because I've been told a lot, boys are logical, girls are emotional, and I'm very logical. And I learned, oh yeah, if you're, biologically female, you have, boobs and everything. But if you like sports, if you wear masculine clothing, then you're actually a boy.
This entire ideology hinges on stereotypes. If you look at the most popular resource used all around the world, it's this thing called the genderbread person. So it's a picture of a gingerbread man. And it defines right on there what gender identity is. It's based on your personality, your likes and dislikes, your jobs, your hobbies, your roles.
So a girl who loves to play with trucks, likes to roughhouse, or being asked to look at that girl and wonder if, she doesn't like pink. She doesn't like to play with dolls. Maybe she's really a boy. Right? Or a little boy who loves to play with My Little Pony is like, I wonder, maybe he's really a girl.
These are 1950s sexist regressive stereotypes. If I want to work in the kitchen all day, does that put me on the woman end of the spectrum? Apparently, according to gender ideology.
There's a document, a paper that's handed out to kids that asks them to place themselves somewhere on the gender spectrum from Barbie doll to G.I. Joe. Where are you on the spectrum? And it implies that if you're not completely a Barbie doll or you're not completely a G.I. Joe, you're not a man or a woman, you're something in between. And that's absolutely ridiculous. And what a message to give our kids that, oh, you can't have short hair if you're a girl because that means you're a boy. Oh, you can't, wear pink if you're a boy because that means you're a girl. It's completely throwing us back 50, 100 years in terms of rights and freedoms for women.
Feminism has really tried to contest certain stereotypes about women. But now, woman is defined by those very stereotypes. And it really narrows the full range of what femininity and masculinity look like when lived out in the world.
So we've taken the counseling and medical professions and turned them upside down. Doctors and therapists used to help people and heal broken hearts, dealing with root causes and teaching that people are valuable just the way they are. Now, not only are therapists trained not to do that, in many places, it's actually against the law.
One historic day today in Utah as the state became the 19th state to ban conversion therapy for minors.
Conversion therapy is a widely discredited practice that seeks to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. The rule bans it on minors, and therapists could lose their license over it.
Over 20 states in the United States have passed laws preventing therapists from doing anything except affirming a trans identity in a child, and they're called conversion therapy laws.
And what they mean by that is if you you are a licensed medical professional and you have a girl who doesn't feel comfortable being a girl, identifying as a girl, living as a girl, and you help her feel comfortable being a girl, that's considered conversion. But if you give that girl testosterone, if you perform a mastectomy on that girl, if you convert her into a boy, that's considered affirmation. Totally Orwellian language in which performing medical interventions to transform a girl into someone who identifies as a boy is considered affirmation. But affirming that the girl actually is a girl is considered conversion.
And the reason I'm speaking out now is because if I were a little girl today, it's likely that teacher would have agreed that I was a boy and start calling me by that boy's name and using boys' pronouns and allowing me into the boys' bathroom, putting me on a path of being medicalized. I think about what would have happened if I had been put on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones that would have sterilized me. Because probably the biggest joy I've ever had in my life is holding my children. And I wouldn't have been able to have them if they had put me on that path. And I think about all those little girls now who, for whatever reason, have adopted a transgender identity, taking puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and having their breasts chopped off. And I feel like I have to speak out and I have to tell my story. And I have to do everything I can to help those kids.
As compelling as Erin's story is, the activists have a response to this, too. One that is intended to shut down all further debate.
It's not unusual for the parents to hear a professional say, well, I know it's a tough problem, but we have a lot of experience with this, and which would you prefer, a live son or a dead daughter?
These ideological doctors at these children's hospitals, they'll tell the parents, you have two choices. You could have a dead kid or a trans kid. This is brutal. Suicide's complicated, and we should never be weaponizing it like that. And with no other condition do we say, oh, you're suicidal? Okay, let's just give you what you want.
To me, that is emotional blackmail. Therapists are trained, especially with people who tend to be attention-seeking or tend to try to get what they want by threatening suicide. Therapists teach people to express their needs in a more healthy manner. Now, therapists are doing that. Therapists are threatening their clients and saying suicide is the reason to do what I want and to do what I think is right without any kind of collaboration or other exploration.
I'm not vilifying the parents because they're being told that their kid will kill themselves if they don't fully accept this and celebrate this.
Are you saying they should not accept that? Like, there are other alternatives?
As hard as it is and as scary as it is, yes, give your kid a chance to be strong. Don't tell your child you're so weak that, yeah, you will kill yourself. That is such a harmful thing. I believed it. I believed that I would kill myself if I didn't transition because I already knew what it felt like to be suicidal. I was miserable. I felt very weak and vulnerable. I needed someone to tell me that I was strong enough to get through this and that I didn't have to permanently change my body, and that the mainstream message that I'm being told, maybe I should entertain the possibility that that's wrong.
And it is wrong. The suicide statistics simply don't support the mainstream narrative.
Yeah, you follow them for 3 years and you're going to think you hung the moon, especially if your data gathering process doesn't seek out every patient you operated on. If you just seek out the people who happen to walk back in your office and to talk to you about their transgender surgery, well, that's called a selection bias. You're basically talking to people who haven't killed themselves, obviously, and people who are happy enough with their result that they decided to come back and see you. Yeah, if you did 100 operations and your follow-up only includes 22 people, well, what happened to all those other people? Are they in a psychiatric hospital? Have they been incarcerated for a violent crime because they've been taking testosterone for 5 straight years and now they're roid rage? Have they killed themselves? These doctors wouldn't know because they didn't go looking for them. But the Swedish database has saved the day for us because healthcare in Sweden, every event of healthcare gets entered in the same database from womb to tomb. What does that database show? Well, it shows us that if you only follow these people for about 3 to 5 years, you've done them a world of good. But you get beyond a certain point And they're no longer hearing the affirmative messages because people are tired of revisiting that issue after 5-6 years of, oh, you're beautiful, you're wonderful, you're your authentic self, and all that stuff. That hubbub dies away and the interior wound is still there. And if you look beyond about 8 years, the suicidality rate is right back. Taking all patients fully transitioned, they have a higher rate of suicide than the general population.
We see too much regret after this. Is why they're 18 to 20% more likely to commit suicide after they go through this. Why? Because they had a broken identity. And treating them with hormones and surgery doesn't fix a broken identity. It just adds more pain and more suffering. And actually, in a way, it's more abuse. If we look at what the whole process of transgendering is, if we can use that word, it's self-destructive. Every process requires you to destroy who you are.
The simple fact is, affirmation care, medicalization, and surgery only make things worse.
For a while, I was like, I'm just gonna live with the regret. And I lived with the regret for like 1.5 years, and it was the darkest period of my entire life, by far.
7 years down the road of this transition, I was in worse condition than when I initially started. I had more problems 7 years down the road than I had when I first transitioned.
In those 7 years, did your therapist ever connect any of your issues back to the trauma of the sexual abuse?
No, and that's a big question within my mind in reflecting back, because after everything was said and done and I did transition back to male and found peace between my mind, my heart, my body, I started reflecting back what happened, what was going on with me, and my therapist never did dive into the difficulties I had as a child or the sexual abuse, because as a child, I had a speech impediment. I still have a speech impediment, but not nearly as bad as I did as a child. I had a learning disorder. I was dyslexic. I had to go to a special reading lab, and I actually didn't start to learn how to read until I was in the 5th grade. I was uncoordinated. I couldn't play any athletic event very well, and I was always picked last amongst the teams with the boys. I didn't fit in with the boys. I actually felt like I fit in more with the girls than I did with the boys. And my therapist never did dive into any of it.
Part of my theory about why it is that they're not connecting trauma to the development of a transgender identity is that there's a lot of money in this. Pharmaceutical companies are making a ton of money from medicating kids.
Just think of the money that can be made in medicalizing healthy people. And if we're talking kids, right? So you start them on puberty blockers when they're prepubescent. And then the next stage is to give cross-sex hormones.
If you put a child on puberty blockers and then cross-sex hormones, that child is medicalized for life because their body's never going to develop the capacity to make the hormones that the child needs.
And then that lifelong hormonal treatment leads to other complications that then require medical intervention, right? So you're essentially making a healthy person sick and making them completely dependent on expensive pharmaceutical drugs in order to maintain this identity. There's a lot of money to be made there.
Just sex reassignment surgery over the next 5 years is expected to be $1 billion industry. If being transgender is a biologically fixed thing, which I don't believe it is, but if it is, there is a finite number of people for whom that will be true. These market reports say that it's a growth industry. Well, the only way it's a growth industry is if it's being marketed, and it is being marketed.
My psychiatrist just gave me pills. Like, she was just like, oh, I think you have ADHD. Here's some Ritalin, see if that helps. She didn't know me.
How'd you find her?
My therapist actually referred me to her, but funny enough, like, after I stopped seeing her, because I realized, like, she's trying to give me pills, like, she was like, yeah, I kind of wish that I hadn't referred her to you. I don't like her anymore. I'm like, okay.
So she's giving you pills, and then she's the one who signs the letter for your surgeon.
Yes, yeah. She had nothing to do with administering me testosterone, but, like, I was on Zoloft and, like, Ritalin for a while, and so she was in charge of prescribing me those types of things.
Is she making money off of that, I take it?
Yeah.
What do you feel like is the role of money in all of this?
I mean, I like, when I think about it, I become very cynical about everything because I think everything comes down to money. Like, I don't think my surgeon really cared about my well-being because there's just not enough evidence that says that, you know, physically transitioning, if you have any type of gender dysphoria, weird feelings about your gender, is going to help you. There's just not enough evidence that says that that's the one-size-fits-all solution. And like, top surgeons, people who do those surgeries, I feel like they don't want, like, they're not honest about that.
Now hold on. I thought that medicine was a scientific endeavor that followed the evidence wherever it leads.
One of the things that we hear all the time from the proponents of the transgender treatment industry and affirmation care is that we need to follow the science, and that if you were a better doctor and you were more aware of the medical literature, you would realize that affirmation care and transgender medicine and surgery is the only way to go. Well, so I've been a doctor now for roughly 40 years. And in those 40 years, I've been to a lot of lectures. I've read a lot of textbooks. I've read a lot of professional papers. I've written some papers. I've written some textbook chapters. I have never in my professional life ever read a textbook, a journal article, listened to a lecture that described the human person as a spirit being that occupies a body. In fact, the world I grew up in is the world of materialistic, scientific medicine. Well, how do you jump from that to like, well, actually, no, you have the spirit identity person floating around, and they give these children the language. A 9-year-old child doesn't naturally say something like, well, I'm really a boy trapped in a girl's body. That is not the language of children. That's the rehearsed language given to them by adults who staff gender clinics, who have MD after their name. Where did they get that from? Where did they get that from? That is superstitious thinking. It is absolutely stupid, superstitious thinking that goes against all of Western philosophy that gave rise to the university and the medical school in the first place.
All right, things just got a whole lot deeper. What Dr. Lappert seems to be saying is that this is a debate about ultimate things, about the very meaning of life. We are talking about competing views of what it means to be a human being. So what does transgender ideology assume about this question?
First of all, we can see there is a priority of the mind over the body, that the mind is seen as something separable from the body. So, for example, when you think of the I am a woman trapped in a man's body, what you're saying there is that the real me is not my body.
A transgender identity is a splitting of self. It's a saying that your body is somehow a different, almost a different being than yourself.
We live in an age where the body itself has become very depersonalized and objectified.
And I see that kind of with the whole phenomenon of like pronouns in your bio. Because it's like, my body doesn't matter at all. Like, whatever I was born as, throw that out the window. I am whoever I label myself as.
The body is almost this physical extension of me in the world that I can curate according to this real me that's inside and disembodied.
This notion is being taken to new heights in the internet age.
Seems like we're actually trying to become more disembodied, and it becomes increasingly easier to do that and accept that if everything is online.
When you go on the internet, you can curate an online identity that is radically different than your real life. And so I think some of what we're seeing is, as young people get so immersed in that online environment, they almost try to take their online identity and bring it out into the real world.
Dr. Truman has a term for this: expressive individualism.
Expressive individualism is the idea that every individual person has a core of inner feelings. And in order for that person, that self, to be authentic, that core of inner feelings must be allowed to express itself outwardly.
This is really starting to make sense of the transformation we have seen within many institutions.
When you think of how institutions operated typically in the past, they were places of formation. They were places that you went in order to be transformed into being that which you should be. You went to school to have your rough edges knocked off. Now, of course, schools are there to help students realize themselves, discover themselves. The medical profession, of course, once upon a time, the medical profession was there to cure people. Now, of course, it's taken on a profoundly psychologized sort of function, precisely because the ethos of the society in which we live in is one of personal affirmation, and even the medical profession must bow to that.
So to flesh that out a bit, teachers, therapists, and doctors have to deny the physical reality of a child's body in deference to a child's desires and choices, because these desires represent the child's authentic self, the real person, and the body is simply an artist's canvas which should display this non-physical, real self. So how does this dualistic view of the person compare to the classical view, the one on which Western civilization, and all our institutions, was based?
The classical idea would be that human beings are an indivisible whole, a unity of, in classical terminology, body and soul.
That the human person is a hylomorphic being. It means that body and spirit together comprise a single nature. It's not that you have a spirit nature that fills what may or may not be the right body. The two things together comprise the human person.
So we can make a distinction between body and soul, but ultimately they're so entwined that one affects the other.
If you separate soul, spirit from body, I do know that there's a medical diagnosis for that. It's called death. And yet this is what we're being sold by the practitioners or the followers of science.
It is important to acknowledge why one might want to get out of one's body. Essentially, to want to get out of your body is essentially to get out from under these three relations: relation to one's parents, to the opposite sex, and to one's progeny.
When you think about it, it's if your notion of the self is the expressive individual, then anything that encumbers you is a problem. And the most obvious thing that makes demands upon you is the family. That's the first institution you're part of.
The idea here is that we want to get out of the body because we didn't get to choose it. We didn't get to decide our physical characteristics, where and when we were born, or the people to whom our bodies are inextricably tied, our family. As such, to be able to live an authentic life in which our wills and desires are supreme, we must revolt against the body and the family to which it is connected. Although this idea has been around throughout human history, it got major traction in the 20th century when it was preached by one of the foundational thinkers of the modern version of this movement, the man who coined the term sexual revolution, Wilhelm Reich.
Wilhelm Reich was particularly concerned to destroy the nuclear family. He saw the nuclear family as the training ground for future fascists.
He really did think that the last bastion of oppression was the body and its sort of entrapment in these familial relations.
So for Reich, the sexual demolition of the family was part of his program of revolutionary political liberation.
The idea of freedom from the tyranny of the body particularly resonated with some women, who saw themselves as especially burdened by biological realities of life. Realities such as the fact that women are the ones getting pregnant and nursing babies. The answer, for second-wave feminists such as Simone de Beauvoir, was to disconnect women and the idea of womanhood from children and the bodies that produced them.
She realizes the difference between men and women is that women are more biologically knit to their offspring than men. And so she thought if we could suppress or take away some of that knitting with biology, then women would be on par with men. There wouldn't be much of a distinction.
Simone de Beauvoir makes the point that it's only once motherhood has been shattered that women will be really and truly free.
So she advocates contraception, and she also advocates the state-run childcare.
De Beauvoir certainly wasn't alone in this. Contraception had been pushed as the key to women's freedom for several decades, most notably and forcibly by Margaret Sanger.
She
She's the one who coined the term birth control. She was also behind the original formulation of the birth control pill. And that technology of synthesizing hormones was really new at the time. And it was also being used for the first time in the same era to begin to experiment with giving cross-sex hormones. So that those two technologies, I see those two as connected.
Looking back, there seems to be no question that the birth control pill is connected, not only to the wider practice of prescribing synthetic hormones to physically healthy people, but to the disconnection of personal identity from one's physical body.
Becoming a contraceptive society fundamentally changed the way we think about our identity and our bodies. The separation of sexual intercourse and procreation has made us, I think, as a culture, much less conscious of the fact that we're fertile beings.
Once you have the pill, and especially abortion, it so effaces the meaning of sex that now it is possible for us to say a man is a woman and a woman is a man.
Pope Benedict XVI, before he became Pope Benedict XVI, this was in 1984, he says this: sexuality, which is no longer linked to procreation, will have far-reaching consequences. People will end up demanding the right of escaping from the slavery of nature and demanding the right to be male or female at one's will or pleasure. Render the genitals unable to generate, and eventually the meaning of gender itself will be entirely eclipsed.
Of course, not everyone thought that this was a bad thing.
Famous Marxist feminist Shulamite Firestone said, what we're after is the elimination of the sex distinction itself.
In her book, The Dialectics of Sex, makes a remarkable prediction really about the future, saying human beings will reach a point in sexual liberation where conception will not depend upon the sexual act, where child rearing will not be the preserve of one sex or the other, where conception indeed might not be the prerogative of one sex or the other. She's writing this in 1970, long before the transgender revolution, long before transhumanism, long before the hypothetical notion of womb transplants was being touted.
Professor Truman's connection of transgenderism and transhumanism is not incidental here. They are essentially the same thing. Indeed, one of the world's major promoters of transgenderism is Martine Rothblatt. Born Martin, Rothblatt was a pioneer in the area of satellite technology and is now CEO of United Therapeutics, a biotech firm founded to save Rothblatt's daughter's life. Conquering death is Rothblatt's main goal in life, and the way to do that, according to books such as Virtually Human and From Transgender to Transhuman, is to start by storing what he calls our mind file.
A mind file is the collection of their mannerisms, personality, recollection, feelings. All of this information stored there will be able, in the next couple decades, once software is able to recapitulate consciousness, be able to revive the consciousness which is immanent in our mind file.
This is more than science fiction for Rothblatt.
Bina 48 is a proof of concept robot based on the personality and on the mind file of my wife, Bina.
Martine married Bina 30 years ago, and 5 years ago created Bina 48 as a digital replica uploaded with the original's memories, thoughts, and even feelings.
Martine is my love, my timeless love.
Is your thinking here, part of your hope here, is that this version of Bina can, in a sense, live on forever?
Yes, not just Bina, but everybody.
So the quest for immortality, the idea that the real you is a ball of thoughts and desires that exists apart from your body and can be downloaded into a robot and live forever, that your body and all its limitations is a roadblock to that goal, that is the transgender philosophy.
In the end, is essentially, in a nutshell, is a kind of a war with reality, a war with a prevenient natural order. Indeed, the grand dame of the transgender movement, and Judith Butler, channels Nietzsche when she said in the beginning was the deed. She does imagine that we can sort of go back to nothing and reconceive ourselves according to our own wills.
Kind of being like God in creation, where God forms Adam's body like from the dust of the earth. So today, it's almost the same thing. Like, we want to be God, to form our body in our image and make it how we want it to be.
In the old world, God was the hero, the creator, the one who created us with a nature to which we had to conform ourselves in order to flourish. The modern narrative is really one where Satan is the hero, the one who rebels against God, the one who asserts his own selfhood over against the selfhood that God has created him with.
So much of this movement, the trans movement, is it doesn't want to recognize the obvious limits to humanity. We don't want to embrace that. We want to, like Adam and Eve and the serpent, say no.
Embracing the unnatural is a way to show that the natural never defined us. You know, it's really literally a way to reject the cosmos that God created.
This kind of does bring to a pinnacle the idea that we are self-creators. Unfortunately, that just isn't the nature of actual reality, and so it's not going to work out. It's not any way to, actually achieve happiness. It's no way to run a society. And then the only question is, how long does it take to recover sanity on this?
For Daisy, the road back to sanity started only 3 weeks after her surgery, as she realized she was still miserable, and the steps she had taken had only made things worse. Rethinking her understanding of what it means to be human played a big part in her detransition.
If you're telling someone that they're born in the wrong body, you're telling them that there's something wrong with them, that the body that they were given. And, that's sort of a theological idea that I ran into when I was detransitioning. It was just sort of this idea of like, my body was given to me. It was really mind-blowing to think about it that way, because growing up, I just kind of was very indifferent to my body. I almost felt like I didn't have a body or want to have a body. But there was a moment where I realized that, like, whether or not I consider myself Christian or believe in this type of God or whatever, like, my body was given to me. It's not for me to control or manipulate in such a drastic way. I'm arguing with God when I tell myself that, no, I'm actually supposed to be a boy. And who am I to argue with fate or God or whatever you want to call that?
The activists don't see arguing with God as a bad thing, though. They explicitly hate creation, especially the body and the traditional family structure to which the body ties us. This really started to help me make sense of another very concerning aspect of the trans movement, just how anti-parent it is.
There will come a time when you have to choose yourself. If you had toxic parents, they encouraged you to choose them. They were constantly rushing you around, trying to get you ready and get you out of the house. And to get you like on the honor roll and to get you achieving so that it would reflect well on them. When are you going to choose you?
The transgender movement is very anti-parent. And if you just look at the word dead name, what does that word dead name mean? Dead name is supposedly the name that your parents gave you, which, by the way, that is the first gift a parent gives a child that parents have spent a lot of time thinking about and often has a lot of meaning to it. So dead name, that child is being told to kill off who he or she was. When that person is dead, they're no longer connected to their parents. They're not connected to their ancestry. They're not connected to their aunts and uncles and cousins. Now, everything revolves around that trans community. Anyone who doesn't agree with your medicalization and your deadness to your old life gets cut off. They are completely isolated in that community, away from everything else that would connect them to life, to family, to community.
This does start to have a certain feel, doesn't it?
I haven't used the word cult, but I know a lot of detransitioners will call it a cult.
It is a cult.
It's a cult. It's a total cult.
I think the biggest telltale sign is how the detransitioners are treated.
When someone leaves, everyone that's remaining in the religion is forced to cut them off.
Why are they only cared about when they have a trans identity? And when they don't have a trans identity, they're thrown out like the garbage.
They love bomb. They go out and they find somebody who's vulnerable for some reason, and they love bomb them. The GSA clubs, spectrum clubs, equality clubs, these clubs in schools are recruitment centers.
Once my friends realized that I was a newbie to all of this, they went, oh my gosh, we gotta educate this person. And so they started bringing me to the GSA club, where Looking back, it was a terrible idea.
They give these kids a whole new language, gender queer, gender fluid, gender expansive, all of these new words. This is a lexicon that's been created for this cult. Those who use the lexicon are a part of the cult. Those who are outside of it are the TERFs, the bigots, the homophobes, the transphobes. And that's another part of cult life, is that they vilify anybody who's outside the cult as those are the wrong people, those are the bigots, those are the bad people, you don't want to be with them.
And as we've seen, often those bad people are family members.
So one of the things I needed to get over, I'm no contact with my family. All of them. Siblings, parents, extended family, cousins, everybody. And the thing I wanted to point out to you today in this video about going no contact is I didn't consider my own feelings. As painful as it is, the pain of being a person who goes no contact is nothing compared to the daily pain you've been in from being in relationship with these folks. I love you. Have a good time going no contact.
Unfortunately, anti-parent behavior is now practiced even by the people parents used to trust the most.
Local family claims Clay County school leaders held secret meetings with their child over gender identity confusion, and now they're suing. The father says the school didn't tell him until after the student attempted suicide.
They've actually created a checklist, a how-to guide for schools to transition minors without their parents knowing about it. And they're doing this at the kindergarten level.
I just read this book to a grade 1 class, and one of the students came out as trans.
It is completely okay with my admin that I'm running this club during school hours because some of their parents don't know. It would make them feel more comfortable to just, do it at school. That way it's a little more, discreet.
We know that children's success in school and life, the strongest predictor for that is the involvement of their parents. This is what mystifies me about what schools are doing, because for years, schools have been trying to get parents more involved. Get their kids doing their homework, have the parent help out in the classroom. We know that the parent involvement is the strongest predictor of success. Now schools are trying to cut parents out of the equation altogether. That makes no sense. That's ridiculous.
At this point, I would tell parents that they should not have their kids in public education because there's too much going on behind parents' backs.
The goal of the transition closet is for our students to be able to wear the clothes that their parents approve of, come to school, and then swap out into the clothes that fit who they truly are.
They're absolutely working to undermine parental authority. You have to keep it secret from parents. You have to use the name that the child wants. You have to use the pronouns the child wants. It has to be the child that gives you permission, because if the parents don't go along with it, it could create an unsafe place for the child at home. And so we need to make school the safe place. But I think it's actually the opposite, because the parents are the ones that love that child the most. They're the ones that are out to protect that child. They're the ones that know that child. And so for the school to have the arrogance of taking on that role is really going to hurt kids.
So people are now in tune with how teachers are shutting parents out. What I don't think people are in tune with is how much therapists are doing this exact same thing. I remember the frustration as a social worker thinking, these parents aren't involved, we need to get them more involved. There's better outcomes when the parents are involved. And now there's a cultural shift to shut out the parent.
So I often will tell people not to take their children to therapists anymore. And I hate that. I hate that I have to tell parents that they can't trust therapists, that they can't trust healthcare providers. Oftentimes they can't trust teachers. I hate that. Teachers were so important to me. Teachers saved my life. I feel like I had some phenomenal teachers who recognized that I needed a little extra care. And nowadays, I believe those same teachers would believe that it was in their best interest and in my best interest to affirm a transgender identity because they've been brainwashed.
Collaboration between parents and children is the only way to provide therapy. And if there isn't collaboration, that is poor therapy. And I could call it malpractice.
The present stage of the sexual revolution amounts to a vast intergenerational science experiment. C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man understood and spoke quite profoundly about how those who live downstream from the scientific conquest of nature will not be the most powerful, but the least, because the shape of their lives will have been fated by those who came before them. By taking the very definition of our nature in hand, both theoretically and practically, and undertaking this experiment, we are profoundly shaping the future of subsequent generation in ways that we have not even begun to think about.
While we may not know exactly what we are doing to future generations, we do know one thing. The current generation is in crisis.
You even get alienated from yourself, or your body is alienated from your soul. So it's a very deep, profound alienation. And that's really where we find ourselves today. There's an epidemic of loneliness out there. And the further you go down this rabbit hole, the further your descent from reality into this insanity, the deeper that loneliness becomes.
This is why people are throwing themselves off buildings. We've lost sense of what it means to be human. And we are setting out as the vision of our humanity, a vision that is in itself death-dealing, rupture of body and soul.
The reason why I'm really speaking out against this ideology of gender is that I think it harms people.
People with gender dysphoria, people who identify as non-binary, they are not the enemy here. They are the victims. The people that we should be most opposed to are the people pushing the ideology, right? Because, there are adults who should know better, who are pushing just a really, really misguided ideology on young people.
It's this cultural juggernaut that's churning people up. And I think we need to make sure that our communities and our parishes are places where refugees can find welcome.
People who identify as trans or non-binary, I think we should have nothing but compassion, sympathy, and patience.
Speak out against the ideology, to push back against activists, but to also just be very welcoming and loving toward people who are being harmed by this ideology.
One of the goals that I have and the people that I work with have is to approach this from a position of compassion. And we are not doing this because we're anti-transgender. We're doing this because we don't believe there is such a thing as transgender. We believe that there are children who have been victimized, who are suffering, who are traumatized, who have adopted a transgender identity as a coping mechanism, and we care deeply about them. And we don't want them medicalized, and we don't want them to believe that they're inherently flawed. And that is the loving approach. It isn't in any way loving to tell a child that they should become somebody else because who they are isn't okay. That's not loving, that's not kind, that's not compassionate.
How important is we'll call it the God aspect, that if the problem is a broken identity, can you find it other than through the one who made you?
That is a great question. And I think from the people that I've worked with, the vast majority of them come to this realization through some faith process, as I did. I found the Lord in prayer coming to me and redeeming my life. So I think when we allow the Lord, when we see that when the sperm hits the egg, he's done the deal, it's already fixed, you can't change it, and you begin to examine the truths and examine those things that happened that caused you to not like who you are, you have the opportunity to come back and say, what I did to myself was wrong. But we can ask for forgiveness. And the beauty is when we do that, when we say we're wrong, ask for forgiveness, we can reach out and be redeemed and restored to live out a life that does honor and glorify Christ.
7 years down the road from transitioning, that initial surgery, I was in another pit of despair. Suicidal thoughts were coming in my mind, and I was even more in despair at that point. And I'm like, God, I have done absolutely everything I could to live. And I've made a mess of things. There is no way out that I can see. I turn my life to you, over to you. I turn myself over to you. Jesus, I need you. And I turn all of my problems over to you.
The one thing about faith is it allows you to breathe, to feel your life come back. You've been filled up and you've been enriched by this great power through the Lord Jesus Christ that you don't get if you don't embrace the Lord as your Lord and Savior.
There are things we can do with counseling. There are things we can do with appropriate therapies, but they have to be informed by an adequate anthropology, a proper understanding of what a man is and what a woman is, and a recognition that all of this confusion, Jesus Christ addresses in one very short and concise expression. In the beginning, it was not so. And here's the good news. Through his death and resurrection, Christ came to restore creation to the purity of its origins. And sure, Facebook may list, over 50 gender options to choose from in your personal profile. But Christ cuts through all of that confusion when he says, haven't you read that in the beginning, God created them male and female? Christ came to restore creation to the purity of its origins. And there is real power flowing from the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ for that restoration to take place in our own lives, whatever our confusions, whatever the ruptures we all experience between body and soul, and we all experience a rupture there to some extent. Christianity has always stood in marked contrast to that dualistic rupture of body and soul by proclaiming not a salvation from the flesh, but a salvation of the flesh. Christ took on flesh to redeem our flesh. God took on a body to redeem our bodies. Religion is not as it is often thought to be, at least the Christian religion is not as it is often thought to be, a flight from the body to reach a spiritual reality. It is rather the opposite movement. It's God taking on a body to reach us. This is our faith. Our faith as Christians centers around Christ, the Word made flesh. And that's where the war is. It's a war for incarnation versus excarnation. And what we're living in today, this Gnostic split, where the body has no say on my identity, that's the religion of the anti-word. That's the religion of excarnation. We must proclaim faith in the incarnation. This is our salvation.
What really is, I think, motivating me to get the reconstruction surgery, even though, they won't function as natural breasts would, I had to ask myself, okay, so is it just aesthetics? And it's it is aesthetics, but it's not just aesthetics. I don't want to see this anymore. A little past 7 a.m. and in about an hour, I am going to the hospital to be induced. And I can't believe that I'm gonna be meeting my baby soon. None of this was planned, if I'm being completely honest. I was very surprised when I saw the positive pregnancy test. I had a lot of felt really scared, and in the very beginning, I almost felt kind of unhappy about it. Just because I just had other plans. But of course, over time, I became very excited and have gotten more used to the idea of becoming a mother. And when I think about the second biggest life change that I went through, which was transitioning, I planned that whole thing, thought about it every day, fought for it, paid a lot of money for it, had my most important relationships be jeopardized by it. And it was all about me, because that was where my head had been my whole life. Everything was just about me, 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 and what can I do to self-actualize myself. Now I'm just bowled over with gratitude that God would allow me that God would allow my body still, after what I've done to it, to not just get pregnant, but to have a healthy pregnancy and a healthy baby boy. I mean, how can I respond to that other than through worship and praise? I don't know. There's no other way. This is Gabriel. He is my son. He is 2 weeks old today.